All right, today we're going to talk about the civil rights in the 1960s. Now, remember, in previous two lessons ago, we talked about the 1950s civil rights, and prior to that, we talked about early civil rights activists such as Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Booker T. Washington. Today, we're going to cover Martin Luther King and a few other activists that were involved in this movement. But I really want to focus heavily on the beginning of the whole thing because this is the most important organization that's going to help push through a lot of these civil rights laws is going to be the NAACP, which is basically comprised of many lawyers from mainly Howard University. Um, with these lawyers working together to try to achieve civil rights for African Americans. You have African American members, you also have white members working in that as well. And it's going to be instrumental in achieving these goals. All right, one of the first major events that we need to cover is going to be the March on Washington. It was in 1963. The whole goal for this was to try to achieve equality in the workforce, as well as gaining civil rights freedoms and civil liberties for African Americans, especially in the Deep South, which is where a lot of these movements are going to start because it's going to be where it's needed the most. So Martin Luther King Jr. is going to spearhead the March on Washington, and they're going to bring awareness to Washington right in front of the government, which is huge for bringing national awareness to the issue of segregation and discrimination throughout the country. So it's a big move. You had a lot of people show up for the march. You had a lot of people watch it on TV and the media. So a lot of politicians are influenced by this. A lot of Northerners are also influenced by this. One of the things you need to know about Martin Luther King Jr., which you probably already do, is that he was a huge advocate of nonviolent protests. So, sit-ins, marches, those are the kind of the strategies that he's going to utilize. And he takes a lot of this, his influence comes from Gandhi, which was in the Indian independence movement, where he saw that they were able to get rid of the British influence and colonization within that society by using nonviolent protesting. So they're going to bring that over here and they're going to utilize that. And he's very big on this because anytime that these marches or certain events turned into violence, he was very quick to denounce those things and say, hey, like, this is not what we're about. Okay, so a huge proponent in making these civil rights changes is going to be John F. Kennedy. Him and Martin Luther King Jr. They had a couple of meetings where they talked about civil rights and the future for African Americans in this country, and they had things set in place. And John F. Kennedy was pushing hard to go into changing civil rights laws in America. Unfortunately, though, remember he was assassinated in Dallas in 1963. So his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, is going to take over. And from there, he's actually going to work extremely hard for civil rights to carry on the ideas that John F. Kennedy had proposed in the beginning. All right, that kind of takes us into the Mississippi Freedom Summer, which is going to take place throughout 1964. And really, what this whole thing was about was trying to gain more registered voters that are African American. So going through the South in deep southern states such as Mississippi and trying to increase the amount of African Americans registered to vote and getting them out there to vote. Again, they recruited white college students from the North to come in and help out, try to get people registered. They would go through and teach them about civics and other in Black history, but then as well as how to go through the process of doing these things. Because remember, a lot of these people were persecuted against in the South and were by using like voter intimidation and other tactics, the uh, the Southerners were able to kind of keep African Americans from voting. So this is a big push to kind of like break that and get them to start getting involved in elections. Unfortunately, some of the people that were like major civil rights workers that were involved in this were actually they disappeared for a little while. No one knew where these people were, and then it turns out later on that they were murdered. So this is going to gain national attention, and it actually increases the amount of support for the civil rights legislation. So because of a lot of the national attention, more awareness, these nonviolent protests, African Americans are able to achieve the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is going to get passed by Lyndon B. Johnson. And the whole focus of this act was to prohibit discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. So remember now, Brown v. Board of Education that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which had stated that separate but equal was okay and that was constitutional. But Brown v. Board said, hey, this is not okay to do. But remember, this was kind of tied solely to the education system, so public schools. So there was still segregation that continued after Brown v. Board. And so this act here is going to actually remove any segregation from any public accommodation. So no longer can restaurants and hotels and stores segregate and refuse to serve people of a certain race or religion or any like nationality. And again, this is going to be Lyndon B. Johnson who's going to play a major role in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So after they had tackled that, they're going to move again heavily into trying to influence African American voting rights and to try to achieve equal rights for elections. So the Selma campaign is going to be instrumental in achieving that. There's going to be multiple attempts at staging a large march. The first one, they say we're going to march, from Selma to the capital of Alabama, Montgomery. But unfortunately, in this first march, it turns extremely violent, and many protesters are beaten by police officers that are standing there to prevent them from, staging their march. Um, but the positive side of this was that there was television crews and news that was broadcasting this, so a lot of these things were actually caught on tape, and it recorded a lot of the things that went on. And the incident goes to be called Bloody Sunday. And so again, we're looking at awareness. We're looking at the national awareness and the national spotlight that these campaigns are achieving. And again, that is showing what is going on in the Deep South for everyone else in the country who hadn't been able to see these before. So they're starting to say, hey, we need to call for some changes and make some changes here. All right. So after things had gone that way, LBJ is going to give a speech which is denouncing the violence that happens in there. And so when they try again to do the march, this time he makes sure that he talks to the governor to say, hey, like this cannot happen again. You are to allow these people to do their march. And so the second march is actually going to succeed in arriving to Montgomery and calling upon the Capitol to change their voting habits and what they're doing with their elections. And this will eventually lead to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which once again is going to be passed during the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. And basically, what this does is it outlaws all of the Jim Crow laws that were created in the Deep South to prevent African Americans from having an equal opportunity of voting. Right, so they outlawed literacy tests. They sent federal registrars down so that now you had people that were employed by the federal government rather than the state government to take people's votes. And also, what this is going to do is it's going to increase the amount of African American voters because you kind of remove that intimidation factor. You remove all these obstacles and boundaries that had prevented African Americans from being able to fully participate in American elections. Later on, this will actually help achieve other laws that will help the civil liberties of other Americans and different groups. You'll see that it will eventually include people with disabilities. And so you're going to see here with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, where now we are going to prohibit discrimination on the basis of disabilities within federal programs. And so that's also going to help out with, achieving rights for not African Americans, sorry, achieving rights for all Americans, including people with disabilities. And later we'll also see Individuals with Disability Education Act. And what that's going to do is take the Rehabilitation Act and then broaden it down to schools and for children in schools with disabilities. This whole time period under the Lyndon B. Johnson administration is going to be referred to as the Great Society. This is he coins this term as an idea that's going to basically end poverty, It's going to reduce crime. It's going to try to get rid of inequality, and it's going to improve the environment. So these are all the issues that LBJ wanted to tackle in his idea of a great society. And so he actually pushes extremely hard to achieve these goals. So you see programs that are created like Medicare, you have Medicaid, and then you have Economic Opportunity Act, which is going to grant funds to vocational training, which when we remember we talked about vocational training with Booker T. Washington, which was like the idea that you have like trade jobs such as like let's say welding or plumbing. So it actually allocated money to programs such as this for kids to go to work. You also had the Job Corps, which will train youths, right, to go on to work in urban centers. So again, you see a lot of this stuff is going to expand the United States government and its role in America. But you're going to see a lot of ways that we are going to try to improve the American society, and LBJ is instrumental in doing that. And the last thing we're going to cover is the Immigration Act of 1965. So what this did here was it reversed the immigration acts that were set in place in the 1920s. So as you remember, when we got into the 1920s, um, America decided that we had enough immigration and we no longer needed it. So they put the quota acts on there. They prevented certain groups from being able to come in. So what this is going to do is reverse those things, which will allow immigrants to come back into the country in larger numbers. And that's it, guys. Hope everything's going well. Stay tuned for the next lesson. See you later.